The wind smelled of blood and burnt lacquer. The moon, once serene, now hung like a blade in the night sky, shining coldly upon the capital of Goryeo. Gyeongjong, the jewel of the northern kingdom, was no longer a city, it was a wound torn open by treachery and steel. The screams had quieted hours ago, but the echoes lingered, trailing through the broken palace halls like the ghosts of courtiers who no longer dared to speak. In a narrow corridor lit only by a flickering oil lamp, Wang's son ran barefoot, his royal robes ripped, blood caking his ankles from a cut he could not remember receiving. Behind him, a body fell, one of the few loyal guards who had tried to hold back the tide. He didn't look back. He couldn't. If he had, he might have seen the exact moment his uncle's assassins slipped through the eastern gate, or the silent falling of his own mother's body beneath a crimson banner. But he didn't stop running until the palace walls were a smear of smoke in the distance. He was no longer a prince. He was prey. The woods beyond Gyeongjong were darker than usual. A thick fog clung to the forest floor as if the world itself conspired to hide him. Twigs cracked beneath his feet. The low cry of an owl sent a tremor through his spine. He could no longer distinguish the sound of his breath from the whisper of death following behind. When he finally collapsed by the riverbank, face first into the cold moss, he did not expect to open his eyes again. But he did. And when he did, she was there. A woman in gray robes, weathered by rain and time, her head covered, her face partially veiled. Her eyes were the first thing he saw, sharp, unfaltering, and ancient, not with age, but with knowing. "Don't speak," she said in a voice so low it blended into the mist. He didn't. He couldn't. His throat burned and the words of his lineage choked him more than the blood pooling in his mouth. The woman didn't ask his name. She didn't offer hers. She merely pressed a bowl of bitter tea to his lips, cradled his head as if he were a child, and began to chant a language he couldn't understand, but one that settled into his skin like the weight of stone. He awoke the next morning in a hut carved into the mountain's side, far beyond the reach of any known road. His wounds had been cleaned, his robes replaced with rough peasant cloth. The woman sat in the corner, boiling herbs. Outside, the fog had not lifted. "You are not dead," she said without turning. "But many things you believed in are." He sat up, ignoring the protests of his broken body. "Who are you?" "Someone who has no need for names," she said. "But I know yours, Wang's son." That name struck him harder than any blade. He hadn't heard it since the coup. Even now, his mind recoiled from the memories, his father's madness, his mother's tears. The cold ambition of General Gangjo, who seized power in the name of justice but had turned the royal court into a battlefield. "You saved me." "No. I found you." "Saving is something only you can do." He frowned. "You speak in riddles." "No," she said, rising to add dried roots to the steaming pot. "I speak in truths you are not yet ready to hear." "For 3 days?" She refused to answer his questions. He tried to leave once, only to find the paths looped back to the hut as if the forest itself conspired with her. She gave him food, tended his wounds, and each evening lit incense before a wooden statue with no face. "You believe in nothing?" he asked on the 4th day. She looked at him, her eyes unreadable. "I believe in everything. That's why I choose silence." He stared at the flame flickering in the dark. "My uncle will declare me dead. Gangjo. He'll take the throne. Then take it back." He turned sharply. "With what?" "I have no army. No allies. No strength." "You have breath," she said. "That is the beginning of strength." In the silence that followed, something cracked in him, not his pride, but the fear buried underneath. It wasn't just death he feared. It was meaninglessness. To die as a fugitive, forgotten, unloved, unavenged. That terrified him more than swords. "Why help me?" he asked finally. "You live alone, hidden. You gain nothing from me." The woman lowered her gaze. "Perhaps I see the reflection of another boy who once failed to fight for what mattered. Or perhaps you are the fire that must rise from ash. Either way, the path is before you. Walk it or die here in obscurity." He slept little that night. The dreams came again, flashes of the throne room painted in gold, now stained with blood. Of his father's distant face, his voice echoing from 1,000 memories. Of the woman beside him, chanting not words, but truths. When dawn broke, he stood outside the hut. The air was cold, his breath fogged. "I will return," he said. The woman handed him a small satchel, herbs, a thin blade, and a parchment folded thrice. Don't open this until the first time you must choose between justice and survival, she said. And never forget, the crown you wear will weigh more than any enemy's sword. He bowed not because she asked, but because he needed to. She watched him leave without a word. As he vanished into the trees, she turned to the faceless statue and whispered, "Another fire begins." Wang's son emerged from the mountains weeks later, no longer a prince in appearance, but something quieter, sharper. He kept his head down, moved through villages like a phantom, listening to the whispers. He learned Gangzhou had claimed regency, using Wang's son's name to justify his seizure of power. The hypocrisy burned in his chest. In a distant monastery, loyalist scholars hid fragments of history, truths erased from official edicts. Wang's son knelt with them by candlelight, not as king, but as a student. He read Buddhist texts, listened to tales of emperors who ruled with both sword and prayer. Each page reminded him of her, the woman with no name. She had planted something inside him, and now it burned. Within the year, he rallied the remnants of his father's court, disillusioned nobles, broken generals, monks who believed a throne meant more than power. One by one, they returned not for gold, but for the idea that something better could rise. In 1009, Wang's son re-entered Gyeongjong not as a fugitive, but as King Hyeongjong of Goryeo. His coronation was subdued. No grand festival, no parades. The people watched with wary eyes. Some whispered of Gangzhou's betrayal. Others praised the young king's survival. But all agreed this was not the boy who had fled a burning palace. This was a king born in ash. But the fire had only just begun. As he stood alone in the royal garden that night, wind brushing through the lantern-lit trees, he opened the parchment she had given him. The words were simple. Power means nothing if your people are still afraid in their sleep. He folded the note, placed it inside his sleeve, and looked up at the moon. Far in the mountains, in a hut no longer marked on any map, the woman watched the same moon and allowed herself a small smile. History had begun to turn, and the world would remember neither her name nor her face. But her fire would burn in the heart of a king. The scent of pine needles was heavy in the air, mingling with the distant hiss of boiling water. At the edge of the mountain ridge, where the clouds kissed the cliffs and the wind sang through the tall cypress trees, the woman in gray robes knelt beside a fire. The teapot rested on 3 stones, steam rising like incense from its spout. Her hands, weathered but graceful, moved with a rhythm that spoke of long-forgotten rituals. It had been years since the boy, now a king, had walked down the forest path she had shown him. Years since she last heard his voice. Yet, in the quiet of dawn, she still rose and boiled tea for 2. Not because she believed he would return, but because her presence in the world had always been meant for others. A vessel for those lost in their own noise. Once she had been someone. A daughter. A sister. Perhaps even a lover. But names are shackles, and she had broken hers long ago. She watched the mist swirl around the edge of the cliffs, letting her thoughts drift into the silence that had become her only companion. The mountain knew her better than any man. It listened when others demanded. It whispered when others shouted. Her real story, the one history had forgotten, did not begin with Wang Sunday. It began with fire. Years before he ever donned a crown. Before the throne bled itself into 100 rivalries. She had lived in a fishing village along the southern coast. A quiet place where the sea spoke in rhythms and people understood humility not as weakness, but as wisdom. Her father had been a healer. Her mother, a weaver. They had lived simply, devoutly until the day the soldiers came. The warlords of the South, rebels against the crown, had come to extract men for their army and food for their cause. When the villagers resisted, the soldiers answered with fire. She had been 16. She had hidden in a storage cellar beneath the granary while her world turned to ash above. For 3 days she listened to the sound of death scraping against the world she knew. On the 4th, she emerged alone. Her hands shook. Her voice cracked, and she screamed into the wind until her throat gave out. A monk found her days later, an old man, blind in one eye, walking alone with a staff and a bell. He did not ask her name. He only offered her water and silence. It was the first gift she had received in a long time. She followed him north, up the mountain paths, through forgotten shrines and caves filled with the whispers of those who had come before. He taught her how to live with ghosts. How to sit in stillness until the screams in her mind became prayers. His name was Doyen, And though he rarely spoke, when he did, his words struck like thunder across still water. "You must choose," he told her one day, sitting beneath a cedar tree that bent from lightning scars. "To be a vessel or a blade? One carries pain, the other spreads it." She chose to carry it. Years passed. Her hair grayed early, not from age, but from the burden of memory. Her eyes grew sharp, not from judgment, but from watching too many people hide behind their own fear. She became a wanderer, a woman cloaked in no title, moving through villages offering medicine and counsel. Some called her ghost. Others called her witch. Most simply bowed and let her pass. She preferred it that way. But fate, or perhaps something deeper, always pulls even the quietest soul back into the storm. It was in a mountain pass near Ganghwa that she first heard of the prince in hiding. Whispers carried on trade carts and monastery steps spoke of a boy royal, fleeing the ashes of his palace, hunted like a deer, bleeding and alone. She knew then. Before she ever found him on the riverbank, she had already felt his presence in the winds. He was not the first broken man she had saved, but he might be the last who would remember. After he left her care, she remained in the hut for 2 more winters. Occasionally, she would receive word of him through pilgrims or couriers who stopped to rest and trade stories. The boy had become king. The king had survived war. The war had shaped him. She was proud but not attached. Attachment, Doyen had warned, is the first kindling of ego. She watched from a distance, only interfering once when she heard that a certain general, a man of fire and fury, was rising too quickly. Gang Gamchan. She summoned him. It was not a request. When the general arrived, his armor dusty from battle, his pride thicker than his speech, she greeted him not with reverence, but with a bowl of hot tea and a refusal to acknowledge his title. "You train for war," she told him, "but not for what follows it." Gamchan, younger than and arrogant, scoffed. "Victory justifies itself." "No," she said, pouring more tea. "Victory only begins the next struggle." Peace. She kept him for 3 months. No swords, no drills, only meditation, silence, and the reading of texts far older than Goryeo itself. At night, she made him build fires using only damp wood. "Why?" he asked, hands blistering. "Because you must learn how to make light from ruin." When he left, he bowed, not out of custom, but out of understanding. And when he returned to the battlefield, his mind was quieter, his strikes more measured. She never spoke to him again. But she knew what he became. What she hadn't expected was how much Hyeongjong would carry her with him. Not just in action, but in thought. The inscriptions in the Tripitaka. The garden without statues. The decrees focused on education, dignity, and the preservation of the unseen. He had listened. And that, in her long life, was the rarest miracle. In her final winter on the mountain, she lit incense every morning before the faceless statue she had carved herself, rough, unpolished, but honest. She did not pray for peace. She prayed for the endurance of wisdom. She had known many kings. She had walked past 1,000 graves. But never had she seen someone rise from such absolute destruction to become something more than a ruler, something like a guide. A fire that warmed instead of burned. One night, while the snow buried the world in silence, she left the mountain. She carried nothing, not even her name. She walked into the world not to be remembered, but to remember, because that is what the flame does. It lights the way for others and then vanishes before they can thank it. Daejeong had never looked more foreign to him than on the day he returned as king. From the balcony of the royal pavilion, Hyeongjong could see the tiled rooftops stretching across the horizon like the carapace of a giant serpent, smoke curling from chimneys that lined the narrow lanes. The streets buzzed with the hesitant rhythm of a city still unsure whether to rejoice or fear. The palace had been swept clean, the blood washed from its floors, the bodies burned. The banners rehung in ceremonial order. But nothing was the same. He was not the same. The boy who had once hid behind gold-embroidered curtains, listening to ministers argue over protocol while his father drank himself into stupor, was gone. The new king bore the silence of forests, the clarity of rivers, and the sharpness of truth carved by exile. And still, he did not feel ready. It was his 3rd night on the throne when the dreams began again. The same corridor soaked in moonlight. The sound of sandals on polished wood, a low hum in the air, always the feeling of being watched. He would wake with the echo of a chant in his ears and the scent of pine and incense in his nostrils. He knew what it meant. She was with him still. Not in body, of that he was certain, but in thought, in doubt, in the spaces between decisions. The nameless monk had said little in the days they spent together, but each word she offered had rooted itself deep within him, growing like vines around his instincts. Now, as king, he found those words louder than the voices of his advisors. Justice means little if it is only spoken in halls. Do not chase glory. Chase clarity. Power is most dangerous when you forget who suffers from its absence. He recited them in his mind while ministers presented tributes, while generals demanded new fortifications, while eunuchs fluttered around his quarters offering women and wine. He accepted none of it. His rejection of concubines was the first scandal. The second was worse. He delayed the traditional ceremony of royal succession and mourning rites. Instead, he requested private interviews with every surviving court official, one by one, behind closed doors. No scribes. No witnesses. Each man entered the chamber with rehearsed speeches, eyes darting toward the throne as if checking whether it was real. Each left changed. Because Hyeongjong asked them not what they wanted, but what they regretted. It was an unorthodox question, and one that many answered poorly. Some wept. Some raged. A few confessed to betrayals they thought had been buried. He listened to all of it without speaking. When the interviews were over, he issued no punishments, made no condemnations. He simply wrote a list of names and burned it in front of the ministers the next day. What has passed will not be judged twice, he said. But what comes next will be. The court called him naive. The people began to call him wise. Then came the whispers from the north. The Liao were massing troops again. The scars of the 1010 invasion had not healed. Though the Goryeo army had rebuilt, it was still fractured, loyalty divided between generals, regional lords, and nobles with personal armies. The country was a dam patched with straw. Hyeongjong knew the Liao strategy. Provoke first, demand tribute next, invade if resistance smelled weak. Gang Gamcheon had returned to court by now, seasoned and colder than before. He bowed before the king with minimal words, as if language itself had become a luxury. They will come again, he said, tapping a scroll across the stone floor. They do not believe you will fight. And will I? Hyeongjong asked. Gamcheon studied him. Do you want to? No, the king answered. But I may have to. The war councils convened at dawn, each session a cacophony of old grudges and new fears. Some lords urged immediate surrender. Others demanded conscription of monks and peasants alike. Every suggestion dripped with self-interest. Hyeongjong listened. But his eyes never left the windows, where beyond the paper screens, the plum trees had just begun to bloom. That night, he walked alone into the royal archive, past the sealed shelves of forbidden texts and the dusty scrolls of his forefathers. He found the alcove where he kept the only item never recorded in inventory, the folded parchment the monk had given him. He read it again, slowly, tracing the strokes as if they might vanish. Power means nothing if your people are still afraid in their sleep. He lit a candle and placed the parchment beside it. The flame caught the edge of the paper, illuminating the characters before consuming them. He watched it burn until the last ember curled and died. The next morning, he sent a message to every province. The king does not seek war, but he will not kneel. Prepare not for conquest, but for preservation. Prepare not to destroy, but to protect. The people called it the Flame Proclamation. It spread faster than any army could move. In temples, monks repeated it between prayers. In marketplaces, children carved it into wood. It became more than a declaration, it became a vision. Not of violence, but of purpose. And for the first time in decades, Goryeo's pulse began to steady. But not all were convinced. In a smoke-filled room within the western wing of the palace, 3 nobles met behind veils. He speaks in riddles, one said. He governs with ghosts, said another. If he dies, there will be no heir, whispered the third. No wife. No son. The line ends with him. A pause. Then quietly, we can make it end sooner. The plan was subtle, elegant in its cowardice. No blade. No poison. Just the slow erosion of a king's influence, misfiled scrolls, misreported battles, false alarms from distant outposts. Food shipments redirected to loyal estates. It was not meant to kill him outright, but to drown him in the details of a crumbling court. To make the people question slowly whether their king truly knew what he was doing. But Hyeongjong had lived in silence. He had been hunted in darkness. He knew what it felt like to be surrounded by those who smiled while sharpening their knives. And so he waited. He allowed the mistakes. He allowed the missteps. He let the web be spun. And then, with one gesture, he pulled it all apart. On the eve of the new year, he invited the entire court to a ritual of rededication. Hundreds of ministers, nobles, military commanders, and scholars filed into the Hall of Harmony expecting ceremony, incense, and predictable proclamations. Instead, they found the king alone on the dais, dressed not in silk, but in the plain white robes of mourning. A single scroll lay on the floor before him, weighted by a stone. "You have come to bear witness," he said. "To what?" one brave official asked. "To the burial of illusion." He gestured, and servants entered carrying crates, ledgers, reports, letters. They placed them at the foot of the platform and set them alight. The flames climbed quickly, casting flickering shadows across the stunned faces of the elite. "These," he said, pointing to the burning documents, "are the lies you hoped I would swallow. The poisons you brewed in gossip. The ropes you wove from threads of fear. A silence so thick it became a pressure." He continued, "I will not rule by coercion, nor will I fall by it. If you wish me gone, speak now. If you wish to see my death, make your move before the ash settles." No one moved, not even a breath. Then, slowly, a monk from the back stepped forward. One of the archivists, robed and bent with age, knelt. "I bear witness," he said. Then another stepped forward. "I bear witness." Then more, and more, until even the nobles, faced with the full weight of the moment, dropped to their knees. It was not submission. It was clarity. In that hour, Hyeongjong did not reclaim power. He transformed it, from a crown of metal to a weight of trust. Later that night, Gang Gamcheon joined him in the garden where the smoke still clung to the rafters and the embers of truth still glowed in the stone basin. "You took a risk," the general said. "I learned from someone who never raised a sword but broke every shield," the king replied. Gamcheon did not ask who. He already knew. "She still guides you," he said. Hyeongjong nodded. "Every time I stand at a crossroad." "What happens if you can no longer hear her?" The king looked up at the moon. "Then I must become the one who speaks." In the years that followed, the kingdom stabilized. The flame proclamation was etched in temples and taught to children. Local leaders adopted it into their oaths. Crime fell. Grain yields rose. Even some Liao envoys returned with unexpected news that the king of Goryeo, once thought weak, now ruled not just with strength but with something rarer: trust. And still, Hyeongjong did not take a wife. When questioned, he answered the same each time. "I am married to what must be done." But not even kings can outrun mortality. In the 12th year of his reign, the fatigue began to show. He slept less. He ate little. His physicians found no illness, but the weight of a nation cannot be measured in pulses. One autumn evening, while walking through the archive, he came across a child no older than 10 sitting among scrolls he could not possibly read. "Why are you here?" the king asked gently. The boy looked up, startled. "I'm hiding." "From what?" "From yelling. Parents." The boy nodded. "Do they know where you are?" "No, but I'll go back soon." The king sat beside him. "It's all right to want quiet." The boy stared at him. "Are you a librarian?" Hyeongjong smiled. "Something like that." The boy reached into his sleeve and pulled out a small wooden carving, a crude figure with no face. "I made this," he said, "for someone who helped me once." "Who?" "I don't know her name." The king took the figure and turned it in his hands. The wood was pine, the same scent that haunted his dreams. "Would you like me to keep it safe for you?" he asked. The boy nodded, trusting him completely. Hyeongjong tucked the figure into his sleeve and watched the boy disappear into the hallway. That night, he sat in his chamber with the figure in his hand, remembering a riverbank, a cup of bitter tea, and a voice that had never needed to raise itself to command the world. "You were right," he whispered. Then, louder, "You were always right." In the morning, he issued a new decree: the establishment of the Silent Order, a fellowship of scholars, monks, healers, and writers dedicated not to power or politics, but to listening. Listening to the people, to the earth, to what cannot be spoken in court. It was his final great act, and the beginning of a movement that would long outlive him. The Silent Order grew not from decree but from whisper. It began with 10 Monks who had once fought in the northern campaigns, scribes who had lost their hands to frostbite but trained their sons to write, widows who taught children to recite history through rhythm, blacksmiths who had shaped both plows and blades. They wore no special robes. They claimed no hierarchy. But their purpose was clear: to be ears where no one listened, eyes where no one looked. When their first scrolls arrived at the palace, they were filled not with reports of rebellion or drought, but with the small, piercing truths of daily life: a mother unable to feed her child due to temple taxation, a village where wells had run dry while local lords built fountains, a man who carved with statues of faceless figures and left them at the doors of strangers who had helped him. Hyeongjong read every page, and for every page he read, he made one change: a new irrigation project in the west, a tax relief measure in the coastal provinces, a royal edict restricting noble access to temple lands. By the time the court realized what he had done, the reforms had already rooted themselves in policy. Silent rule, one minister muttered. He governs with shadows. He governs with conscience, another replied. And still the king remained alone. No queen, no heir. A nation carried in his breath and sleep. As winter returned, the air thinner than ever before, Hyeongjong began waking with the sound of her voice again. Not dreams, not memories, just words, echoing across years. You carry too much. He would answer aloud. I carry because I was chosen. No, the voice whispered. You chose. Sometimes he would open his window and watch the lanterns flicker across the city. He wondered how many of them had been saved by a policy passed in the quiet. He wondered how many children grew up learning his laws without knowing his face. He wondered what she would say now, if she stood before him. Would she be proud? Would she say he had done enough? Or would she, as always, ask one more question to shake him to his soul? In his 15th year as king, Hyeongjong fell ill. Truly ill. This time, there were no feigned recoveries. No strength of will to override fever. His body simply began to fail. And for once, he allowed it. He ordered no healing rituals, no sacred offerings. He accepted no exotic remedies from foreign lands. He requested only a single favor: to die in the library. His court objected, of course. It was not befitting a king. But he waved them off with a single line. Then make it fit me. They carried his bed into the archives, surrounded by scrolls, carvings, records, the very breath of Goryeo's soul. He lay beneath the wooden beams he had walked under as a child, listening not to chanting, but to pages rustling like wind through the forest. On the third night, a monk from the silent order came to sit beside him. She was young, her face gentle but eyes firm. You made this, she said. No, he whispered. She did. I only kept it lit. The monk nodded. Then, slowly, she reached into her sleeve and placed a small wooden carving beside his bed. It was the same figure the child had given him years ago, now stained with age, polished from hands that had passed it around. Where did you find it? He asked. In the temple of Sangju, passed through 10 hands. Each left it behind for someone else. He touched the figure. She has no name, but her story keeps walking, the monk said. Hyeongjong smiled. And in that moment, the silence was complete. Not absence, but fullness. He closed his eyes. Not because he was tired, but because he had seen enough. In the morning, the nation mourned, but not with trumpet blasts or royal fanfare. They mourned with stories. Children whispered of a king who spoke less and listened more. Villagers carved faceless statues and left them under bridges. Monks copied the Tripitaka not out of duty, but out of reverence. And in the court, Gang Gamchan stood in the royal garden before a tree the king had planted himself. He said nothing. He simply bowed. Then he whispered, she would have been proud. At the edge of a cliff far from Gyeonggi, in a hut rebuilt stone by stone, the wind stirred a gray robe left hanging on a post. There was no body, no grave, but there was fire. And where there is fire, there is remembrance. The cold came early in the year 1010. Snow fell before the harvest was complete, clinging to thatched rooftops and bending the bamboo groves under its weight. In the far north of Goryeo, along the borderlands near the Yalu River, the farmers said it was a bad omen. They were right. The Liao Empire, mighty, swift, and ever watchful, had not forgotten the insult of Goryeo's resistance. The court of Emperor Shingzong had grown impatient with the new king on the Korean peninsula, this soft-spoken ruler who refused to pay tribute, who spoke of peace while sharpening his army. Goryeo's survival during the coup had been seen as weakness. An unstable court, a leader placed by internal rebellion, an easy conquest. But war does not ask permission. It arrives in silence. And then it burns everything. In the first moon of spring, Liao scouts crossed the river under fog, probing the hills around Pyongyang. When they returned, they brought not just maps but confidence. The defenses were thin. Loyalty in the countryside uncertain. And so, 400,000 soldiers marched. They were a force of thunder and dust, armored cavalry from the Khitan steppes, hardened footmen, siege engineers, and slave levies. They brought drums that beat like war gods and banners taller than men. They crossed the river with no resistance. And they did not stop. The word reached Gyeongjong 3 days later, first as rumor, then as truth. In the royal court, panic spread faster than commands. Ministers argued over which gates to close, which bridges to burn. Nobles fled with their families. Royal guards deserted their posts to protect their own estates. But the king remained seated. Hyeongjong's face was pale, not from fear, but from the weight of choice. It had happened before. The same path, the same noise, the same spiral of abandonment. He had run once, and survived. But was survival enough? Gang Gamcheon stood before him, hands behind his back, his face still like stone. "We cannot hold the capital," he said. "I know. Then we evacuate. Take only what matters. Delay their advance with false signals and blockades. Lead them into the forest roads. Slow them." Hyeongjong looked up. "And what of the people?" Gamcheon hesitated. "They will follow. If they believe we lead." The king stood. "Then let them see me walk." That night, under cover of darkness, Hyeongjong left the palace, not in a carriage, not with banners, but on horseback. Beside him rode Gamcheon, and behind them, a procession of scribes, monks, medics, and a single chest containing the most precious scrolls of the royal archive. The city burned the next morning, not by enemy hands, but by their own. The gates were set aflame to deny entry. Bridges collapsed under the weight of fleeing ox carts. The Liao arrived to find a kingdom already bleeding, its capital hollowed, its prize turned to ash. But they were not deterred. They spread south, pillaging towns, enslaving villagers, torching temples. Their generals proclaimed that the king was dead, that resistance was over. In Pyongyang, they raised their banners on the ramparts and declared victory. They did not know the war had only begun, because Hyeongjong was not dead. He was hiding. He moved through the countryside like a myth, appearing in one province only to vanish into another. Rumors told of a king dressed as a monk, praying in fields, tending to the sick. Some said he fought with his men. Others swore he healed wounded children with a touch. All of it was only half false. In truth, the king had no sanctuary. But he had purpose. He slept in abandoned temples, in caves lit by fireflies. In one village, an old woman offered him a bowl of rice and whispered, "Your silence is louder than their trumpets." That night, he dreamed of her again. The monk. She stood beside a river, her robes fluttering in the wind, a single lantern in her hand. "You must not become what you fear," she said. "I fear failure." He answered. "Then do not mistake suffering for failure." He woke to find a candle still burning beside him, though no one had lit it. In the 7th week of the invasion, Gamcheon proposed something dangerous. "A counteroffensive," he said. "With what army?" the king asked. "With the one that follows us already." Indeed, in every town they passed, men and women had begun to organize, not with armor and rank, but with conviction. Farmers with sickles, hunters with bows, monks who had once sworn off violence but now carried staffs like spears. It was not an army. It was a movement. Gamcheon trained them. Hyeongjong inspired them. And together they began to strike. Not in open fields, but in shadows. Ambushes along mountain roads. Raids on supply lines. Night fires in enemy camps. They moved like smoke, seen only after the damage was done. The Liao commanders grew furious. What they had believed a conquest now became a quagmire. Their troops tired. Their supplies dwindled. Their maps proved unreliable. Locals gave false directions. And everywhere they found the symbol, a faceless figure carved into stone. Placed in doorways, carved into trees, scratched into temple floors. They thought it was superstition. But it was a sign. The king was still alive, and he was watching. By the third month, the Liao forces were no longer an army, they were a shadow of one. Discipline frayed. Morale cracked. Snow fell again, but this time it was not silent. It came with the sound of retreating hooves, of men whispering of ghosts in the hills and a king who would not die. The final blow came not with swords, but with a story. A captured Liao scout, half-starved and delirious, was brought before General Gang Gamcheon. When asked where his commanding officers had gone, he only laughed. "They say your king walks in fire," he said. "That he cannot be killed." It wasn't true. Of course. But that didn't matter. The idea had already done more damage than any siege engine. In a temple atop Mount Chongryang, the Silent Order gathered for the first time since the invasion began. They brought with them scrolls from the people, letters, petitions, prayers. In each, a single line echoed again and again. "He does not speak loudly, but we hear him." When Hyeongjong read the letters, he did not weep. He simply sat still, letting their words soak into him like rain through dry earth. It was then that he made his decision. They would not retake the capital by force. They would let it fall under its own weight. He ordered Gamcheon to increase the pressure, cut off roads, poison wells, strike only at the edges. Never commit, never overreach. Turn their own fear into their master, he said. And Gamcheon obeyed. By early summer, the Liao army was crumbling. No reinforcements, no food, no will to fight. They burned what they could not carry, slaughtered the last of their mounts for meat, and abandoned Pyongyang without a single trumpet sounding. The retreat was not glorious. It was a collapse. And Goryeo did not chase them, because Hyeongjong did not want victory. He wanted survival. He entered the capital quietly. There were no parades, no declarations, no throne waiting. He walked through the burnt gates as a man among ruins. And the people came. They emerged from basements, from caves, from temples. They lined the streets not to cheer, but to bear witness. A boy had left them. A king had returned. He stood before the steps of the ruined palace, his robes stained with mud and ash. And he said only one thing: "This is not the end." And it wasn't, because the end never comes with the last battle. It comes when the reason for fighting is forgotten. That night, in the garden where nothing yet grew, he dug with his own hands. No guards, no servants, just him and the earth. And when he finished, he placed into the soil a small carving. A faceless figure. The same one given to him by a child. The same one that had followed him across a burning kingdom. He lit a single candle beside it and whispered, "Your silence led me here." And the wind replied with nothing at all. Just peace. The next day he summoned the court. "We rebuild," he said, "but not as we were." He commissioned new laws, decentralized relief structures, better road networks, local militias accountable not to nobles, but to the people. He began the groundwork for what would become the most revered military-political balance in Goryeo history. And most importantly, he ordered the first stone of the Tripitaka Koreana to be carved, not as a monument to gods, but as a monument to survival. A living memory engraved in cedar and ink. His reasoning? If the enemy could not erase us with fire, then let us answer them with memory. He invited the Silent Order to oversee the project. They accepted. But one member came to him in private. She was old, bent-backed, with eyes that had seen more than she ever said. "I met her once," the woman said. Hyeongjong did not ask who. He knew. "She asked me to carry this," the woman continued, and handed him a threadbare cloth. Inside was a piece of paper. Faded. Fragile. On it only a single line. "To walk without name is to walk with all." He folded it carefully, placed it in the sleeve of his robes, and for the first time in many months, he slept without dreams. Because now, the fire was behind him, but its light would never leave. The smoke of war had lifted, but its scent still lingered in the stones. Daejeong, once the glittering capital of Goryeo, stood half in ruin. Roof sagged. Walls bore scorch marks. Temple bells hung cracked and silent. There were no more trumpets, no enemy banners, no cries of anguish in the streets. But the silence now was not peace. It was a silence that asked, "What now?" King Hyeongjong walked the streets of his wounded city without guards. He stopped at marketplaces where vendors no longer sold but bartered. He visited shrines where the names of the dead had been scratched into wooden beams with trembling hands. He sat with a child who no longer spoke, his eyes wide and dark. clutching a doll made of burned straw. There was no proclamation, no royal parade, no speech about victory. Because there had been no victory, only endurance. And endurance demands rebuilding. He called a council, but not in the palace. He summoned the remaining ministers, generals, scholars, monks, and masons to a charred courtyard where ivy had begun to claim what the fire had left behind. They stood in a circle, uneasy and unsure. This, he said, gesturing around them, is our new chamber. Someone coughed. He continued, we will not rebuild what was. We will build what should have been. A silence followed, thicker than smoke. Then a single voice, uncertain. With what, Your Majesty? Hyeongjong looked at him, not with reproach, but with clarity. With stone. With memory. With will. And then he said the words that would define an era. If we survived fire, then we must become fire. What followed was not order, but movement. The silent order, now a recognized part of the kingdom's governance, spread across the provinces to listen, not to dictate. They collected stories, needs, solutions. Not all were practical. Not all were rational. But they were true. A farmer in Jeolla needed irrigation more than a tax cut. A widow in Gyeongju asked for wood to rebuild her loom, not gold. A monk in Kanhwa offered to turn the temple garden into a school. These small truths became the foundation of national recovery. Hyeongjong personally reviewed the first 100 scrolls of the Silent Order, sitting late into the night with a single candle and a brush in hand. Where once the kings of Goryeo ruled with decree, he ruled with ink, replying not with orders but with questions. Who else can benefit from this? What will sustain this 5 winters from now? Does this solution heal only today? Or does it plant something for tomorrow? In the spring of 1011, he announced his most ambitious decree yet, the creation of the Tripitaka Koreana. A full woodblock carving of the entire Buddhist canon, not for worship, but for preservation, for resilience, for memory. When asked why, he said simply, because the enemy tried to erase us. And deeper in his soul, he remembered her voice. The body burns, the mind breaks, but the word survives. She had said that once when he was still bleeding in her hut, dreaming of thrones and vengeance. Now he understood. The project began not in the capital but in a distant monastery nestled between mountains and river, a place where stone met stillness. Carvers, translators, monks, and artisans gathered by the hundreds. The work was sacred but not ritual. It was manual labor, dusty, meticulous, slow. Each block required days of carving. Every mistake meant starting over. But they worked. Because they believed. And because their king visited them not once but often. Dressed in plain robes, he sat beside them. Carving a few lines at a time, his hands blistered, his mind focused. He never spoke during those visits. But his presence spoke volumes. Elsewhere in the kingdom, the army was restructured. Gamchan, now Lord General, implemented a tiered reserve system, reducing the burden on farmers while increasing readiness. Temples were ordered to share surplus harvests. Nobles were required to house at least 5 displaced families or lose tax exemptions. There was resistance, of course. A lord in the east refused and tried to bribe the council. His land was seized. Another claimed divine blood and refused to house peasants. He was exiled. The message was clear: Goryeo would not be ruled by lineage but by responsibility. And through it all, the king remained steady. He aged, yes, his hair turning silver faster than expected. His eyes grew darker, his posture stiffer. But his clarity only sharpened. He kept the small faceless carving near his bed. Each morning, he lit incense beside it. Not as worship, but as remembrance. One night, in the quiet hours before dawn, he sat alone in the royal library. His desk was covered with reports, some praising, others pleading. And then, a letter, and signed, hand-delivered, sealed with wax shaped like a flame. He opened it. Inside, only one sentence. You do not carry this alone. He looked up. The window was open. The wind smelled of pine. He smiled. And the candle before him burned just a little brighter. By the 2nd year after the war, the kingdom no longer limped, it walked. Markets buzzed again. Temples reopened not only as places of prayer, but as schools, granaries, shelters. Roads that once led only to ruined walls now ended at new villages built from salvaged timber and hope. The phrase Goryeo's second beginning was etched into wooden gates, painted on shop signs, embroidered into festival banners. But even in rebuilding, the weight of memory remained. There were still empty chairs at every table. Still patches of earth where houses once stood. Still faces that flinched when drums echoed too loudly. Hyeongjong knew this. And so he ordered a second project, quiet, humble, but no less important than the Tripitaka. A national record of the dead. Not nobles, not generals, but everyone. Peasants, merchants, servants, monks, children. The task was enormous. There were no ledgers, no consistent records. The only names were those remembered in grief. So the silent order took it upon themselves. They walked from province to province, asking one question. Whom did you lose? Some replied with names. Some with tears. Some with stories. They wrote them all. On the walls of a newly constructed shrine in the outskirts of Gyeong, neither temple nor palace, they inscribed each name in concentric circles. There was no rank, no order, only a ring of memory that expanded every day. The king visited the shrine once a month. He never stayed long, only enough to kneel. Sometimes he would leave a folded note at the base of the wall. Once a monk found one unopened. On it was written, "For those I could not save." In the 4th year of his reign, news came from the border again. The Liao had regrouped. They were not yet marching. But the signs were clear. Fortifications rising. New commanders appointed. Tribute demands disguised as trade offers. Gamchan came to the king's chamber with maps in hand. "We may have to burn again," he said. Hyeongjong closed the window. "No," he replied. "This time we hold." "How?" "By reminding them that what we built from ash is stronger than what they hold in gold." The general didn't answer. He didn't have to. Instead, they prepared. But not with armies alone. They sent diplomats. They offered grain in famine. Medical aid after floods. Not weakness, compassion. And slowly, cracks began to form in the narrative Liao had spun. Their own soldiers spoke of Goryeo's resilience. Its king who walked among his people. Its monks who taught even orphans to read. That winter, a strange letter arrived from the west. A Liao commander, once an enemy, requested an audience with Hyeongjong. He came unarmed. And he came alone. They met in a small tent outside the capital, guarded only by protocol and the weight of history. "You are not the king they told us about," the commander said. Hyeongjong poured him tea. "I try not to be." They spoke for hours. Not of treaties, but of fire. Of memory. Of how hard it is to build. The commander left with a single gift, a woodblock from the Tripitaka. He bowed low as he took it. Months later, reports came that the Liao had halted further advances. No truce, no pact, just silence. Sometimes that was enough. As spring came again, Hyeongjong rode north, not as a conqueror, but as a pilgrim. He visited the monastery where the Tripitaka carvings had reached their 10,000th block. The artisans bowed, offering him the ceremonial hammer to strike the next stroke. But he refused. Let the next one be made by the one who reads it. Instead, he walked the storage halls. Row upon row of wooden blocks. Inked with care, blessed with silence. He paused at one. The carver beside him whispered, "That one bears your sutra, sire." Hyeongjong looked closer. Yes, it was the one he had begun years ago. But it was not his anymore. It belonged to the world. He ran his fingers across the grooves, then stepped back. "I am only the echo," he said. The voice belonged to someone else. The monk beside him did not ask who, because everyone in Goryeo had heard the legend. Of the monk in gray robes. The faceless one. The one who saved a king not with armies, but with questions. And though her name was never spoken, her presence lived in every carved line, in every child who could now read, in every soldier who now questioned before striking. Later that night, Hyeongjong sat alone by a fire outside the monastery. A young novice brought him tea. "Do you really believe we'll never have peace?" the boy asked. Hyeongjong stirred the cup. "No," he said. "I believe peace is something we carry, not something we wait for." He handed the boy a folded note. It read, "Ask better questions." Then he stood and walked into the darkness, toward the next thing that needed rebuilding. In the 7th year of peace, a child was born in the province of Cheongju. He would not be famous in his lifetime. He would not hold office, lead armies, or write poems. But he would grow up reading the Tripitaka Koreana with fingers blackened by ink, taught by a blind monk who told stories not with voice, but with rhythm tapped on bamboo. He would learn that knowledge could be stronger than steel and kindness sharper than the sword. When he turned 15, he would write a line in his journal. "I was not alive when the king rebuilt the kingdom, but I lived because he did." That line would survive 3 dynasties. It would be etched onto a monument long after Hyeongjong's name faded from the lips of courtiers and generals. Because legacies are not measured by palaces or conquests. They are measured by what grows in the soil someone else once bled into. Back in Gyeongjong, the final stones were laid for a structure never before seen in Goryeo. A school open to children of all classes. Not a temple, not a noble hall. A place where fishmongers' sons could learn beside the sons of scribes. Where girls could study poetry, and farmers could learn irrigation techniques born from the scriptures of monks and the notes of mathematicians. It was called the House of Listening, and on its entrance, carved in simple, elegant script, were the words, "Every silence has something to teach." Hyeongjong visited it once before it opened. He walked through its unfinished halls, running his hand along beams still rough with sawdust. A young girl helping her father install floor mats asked him, "Are you the man who built this?" He smiled gently. "No, I only said it should exist." She looked confused. "But isn't that the same thing?" He paused. "Yes," he said at last. "Sometimes it is." When he returned to the palace, he passed the garden where the faceless figure had once been buried. A tree had grown there, now stubborn, curved, but blooming. Every spring it bore white blossoms tinged with a faint gold at the edges. No one had planted it. At least, not that anyone could remember. And yet it stood. One evening, as the king read reports under lantern light, a knock came at his door. It was one of the original members of the Silent Order, older now, slower, but still clear-eyed. She brought a message. "There's a carving," she said, "in a temple far in the south. No one claims to have made it, but it matches your statue." Hyeongjong leaned forward. "The faceless figure?" The woman nodded. "It appeared 3 nights ago, left in the center of the temple floor, wrapped in ash leaves." He did not speak for a long time. When he did, it was only one word. "She's still walking." That night, he wrote in his journal, "I do not know if she was a woman or an idea, or the last mercy I was given before I forgot who I was. But I know this, if one life can change a kingdom, then one silence can rebuild it." He folded the page, pressed it between the covers of a sutra, and sealed the book with wax. He gave no instructions for its release, because he didn't care if anyone read it. He only wanted it to remain. For someday someone would find it, and wonder, and ask, and that he believed was enough. The next day, he rode out of the city alone. No guards, no banner, just a horse, a satchel, and a handful of coins. He passed farmers preparing soil, monks teaching letters, children building wind chimes from broken tiles. No one recognized him. He didn't mind. He slept in a barn that night beside 3 other travelers. One asked him what he did. "I used to hold a heavy thing," he said. The man laughed. "A soldier?" "No," Hyeongjong smiled. "A memory." When morning came, he left before the sun. Only the youngest of the travelers stirred, watching him go. The child would later ask, "Who was that?" The old man would shrug. "A pilgrim, maybe, or a king in hiding." They would never know for sure. But when they returned to their village, they would find a wooden carving placed gently at the doorstep of their home. Faceless, still warm to the touch. The sound of steel striking would echo through the pine forest like a drumbeat from the old gods. Gang Gamchon's blade cleaved the training post in half. The wood snapped cleanly, fell, then rolled into the dust. He stood still, chest rising and falling like the bellows of a forge, sweat gleaming on his neck and forearms. "Again," he muttered to himself. He reset the post. This was his 3rd since sunrise. He had once fought in real battles, flesh, blood, flame. But no war left him as exhausted as the quiet waiting that came after peace. His men had no one to fight. His mind had no enemy to outthink. And so he practiced. Again, and again, until the wood became ghosts. Until the ghosts became memory. The rustle of robes pulled him from the trance. He turned sharply, hand on hilt. But the figure that stood there was unarmed. A woman, robed in gray, face half hidden beneath a deep hood, hands clasped as if in prayer. He blinked. The silence stretched. Then he stepped forward cautiously. "Are you lost, monk?" She did not answer. Do you need something? Still nothing. He narrowed his eyes. Then she said, without raising her voice, You fight as if the enemy is still watching. He frowned. What do you mean? You strike with fear, not discipline. He bristled. I strike with precision. No, she said softly. You strike to forget. He had heard of her, of course. Every soldier whispered about her. The king's ghost mentor. The woman with no name. Some said she was dead. Others said she had never lived. But all agreed, if she ard, it meant something was about to change. He dropped his hand from the sword hilt. Why are you here? To remind you that you are not finished. I've won every battle I've fought. That is the problem, she said. He stared. She turned and walked away. No invitation. No command. Only a choice. He followed. They climbed for hours. Higher into the mountain. Through mystic paths and over stone ridges. He said nothing. Neither did she. At last, they came to a clearing surrounded by fallen trees and carved rocks. In the center, a ring of ash, a fire long cold. This is where the king was reborn, she said, finally. Gamchon looked around. It's just a clearing. No, she said. It's a crucible. She motioned for him to sit. He hesitated, then obeyed. You lead men, she said, but your mind is not quiet. And men follow the rhythm of your thoughts more than your words. I am a soldier, he said. I don't need quiet. I need clarity. Then listen. She placed a smooth stone between them. This stone, she said, has seen more winters than any king. It has felt fire, rain, time, and footsteps. But it does not move unless the earth itself shakes. He raised an eyebrow. Are you asking me to become a rock? No, she said. I'm asking you to learn when not to strike. For 3 days she trained him. No weapons, no commands, only questions. Why do you wake before dawn? Why do you eat when you're not hungry? Why do you fear silence? Each one a blow sharper than a blade. He resisted at first, argued, laughed bitterly. But by the 3rd night he sat by the fire with his shoulders slumped and said, I don't know. Good, she said. That is the beginning. She handed him a scroll, old, faded, filled with diagrams of wind, water, and terrain. This, she said, was written by a general who never drew his sword but won 3 wars. He studied it in silence, and the silence became practice. By the 5th day he no longer asked questions. He watched. He moved slower. He listened to the forest. And when he trained again, his strikes were fewer, his balance sharper. He saw space between moments. He struck only when needed. On the 7th morning she handed him a bowl of water and said, Spill none of it no matter what I do. He nodded. Then she attacked, not with fists, not with blades, but with words. She insulted his pride, mocked his victories, called him coward, brute, puppet. And still he held the bowl. His hands shook, his breath caught. But the water stayed. When she stopped, he stood with the bowl unspilled. She bowed, and for the first time she said his name. Gamchon, she whispered. Now you may lead. That afternoon he descended the mountain. He did not turn back, but he left behind his old sword, buried it beneath the ring of ash. Years later, a child would find it there, wrapped in pine needles and tied with gray cloth, and wonder what kind of warrior would bury his weapon beneath silence. When Gamchon returned to the capital, something had changed. He looked the same, armor polished, step steady, eyes sharp. But those who knew him noticed a stillness beneath his voice, a kind of deliberate weight in his silence, as if every word passed through a crucible before leaving his lips. His soldiers felt it first. He spoke less in drills, fewer commands. But when he gave one, it struck like a temple bell, clear, necessary, final. He no longer berated hesitation. He observed it. And when questioned on strategy, he no longer cited manuals or past campaigns. Instead, he asked questions of the terrain, of the wind, of the enemy's heart. The other generals whispered he's become a monk. But they also obeyed him. Because he won. Not with brutality, but with balance. Not with numbers, but with understanding. When Hyeongjong met him again, it was not in the war room, but in the garden of the silent shrine. The king stood beneath the blooming tree, the one that grew above the buried carving, and looked up at his crooked branches. Gamchon bowed low. You summoned me. No, the king said. I waited. He turned. And in that moment, both men saw it clearly. They had become mirrors of each other. Two survivors of fire, shaped not by rage but by the voice of a woman who had taught them to listen first. She said I strike with fear, Gamchan said quietly. She once told me that I ruled with grief, the king replied, and that both fear and grief must be laid down before one can build anything of value. Neither said her name. They never had to. From that day forward, Gamchan became more than a general. He became a philosopher of war. His battlefield reports began with reflections, not figures. His plans contained contingencies for mercy. S officers were trained in ethics before swordplay. And in the margins of every campaign journal he wrote a single character. Emptiness. Stillness. Not as void, but as space for meaning. Years passed. Small rebellions came and went. Minor threats rose and fell. But the kingdom stood, because those who protected it were no longer seeking glory. They were guarding something sacred. One winter, when snow covered the hills and smoke curled gently from the temple rooftops, a messenger arrived in Gyeong. He carried no banner. Only a note. The seal was simple, a flame drawn in a single brushstroke. The king read it in private. Then summoned Gamchan. It's her, he said. Gamchan said nothing. She's calling us, the king continued. But not with words. The next morning, the two men departed the palace before dawn. No procession. No guards. Only the sound of hooves on frost-cracked stone. They rode west for 3 days, through quiet fields and sleeping villages. On the 4th, they reached a monastery carved into the side of a cliff. There was no abbot to greet them. No incense. Only a stone path that led into shadow. They walked together. In the deepest chamber, lit only by a single beam of winter light, they found it. A scroll. Unrolled. Held in place by 4 stones. On it 3 lines. The sword must rest. The throne must forget itself. And the silence must now be shared. No name. No signature. Just the feeling of her presence, like wind against the skin, unseen but undeniable. The king bowed. Gamchan placed his hand on the scroll. Then on his own chest. Neither spoke. There was no need. They left the scroll behind. Because its words were already within them. That night, beneath the stars, they camped in silence. The fire crackled. The king stirred the coals. She changed us both, he said softly. Gamchan nodded. She showed us what not to be. No, the king said. She showed us who we already were beneath all the noise. They sat in that truth for a long time. When they returned to the capital, the people did not cheer. There had been no battle, but they could feel it. A stillness. A new rhythm in the heart of their leaders. And though no statue was built for her and no law bore her name, her influence lived in every policy that spared a child, in every sword sheathed before it could strike, in every decision made not in anger but in stillness. In the years that followed, the name of Gamchan became legend. Not because of how many battles he won, but because of how many he prevented. In the north, he built defenses not as walls of fear, but as channels of patience designed to delay, to redirect, to discourage. He trained soldiers to read weather patterns, animal migrations, and posture of foreign messengers. He established the first code of military restraint in Goryeo history, a list of 10 principles focused not on triumph but on responsibility. And the 10th principle was simply, strike only when all other voices have fallen silent. He rarely mentioned the woman who had taught him that, but those who served under him said he often stared at the mountains in the distance, as if listening for someone who spoke without speaking. Once, during a training exercise, a young officer asked him a question. General, how do we know when we've won? Gamchan looked at the man for a long time, then answered. When you no longer need to ask. At night, he would walk alone through the barracks, stopping to check on the youngest recruits. If he saw a man sleeping restlessly, he would place a folded cloth beneath his head. If a soldier cried out in dreams, Gamchan would leave a small wooden carving near their cot, a figure with no face. He never explained what it meant, but in time others began to carve them too, and the Faceless Monk became a presence even among those who had never heard her name. Back at the palace, Hyeongjong oversaw the completion of the first full volume of the Tripitaka Koreana. It took 6 years of carving, editing, blessing, and binding. When the final block was inked in, depressed, the king held the first printed page in his hands. It smelled of cedar, ink, and reverence. He placed it on the altar not of a temple, but of the public hall where any citizen could enter. And then he declared, "This is not scripture. This is memory." In the margins of that copy, he personally wrote a dedication. To the voice that never shouted. To the blade that never cut. To the fire that taught the sword how to wait. It was signed not as king, but with a symbol. A single stroke of ash. The years passed quietly, but not idly. Children born after the war now walked freely through the schools that had once been barracks. Soldiers rotated through monasteries as part of their service, not to convert but to reflect. Artists beg, in incorporating the faceless figure into murals, clay pots, and even coins. And in the shadows of these quiet changes, something deeper was stirring. The monks of the Silent Order reported strange messages left at shrines near the border. Warnings. Signs. A storm was forming. But this time, Goryeo would be ready. Not because of its armies, but because of its soul. One autumn morning, King Hyeongjong stood atop a hill overlooking the northern plain. The sky was clear. The wind cold. He held in his hand a letter unsigned, ink barely dry. It read, "They come again. But now you know the rhythm." He smiled, folded the paper, placed it in the flame, and whispered, "Thank you." Behind him, thousands of troops waited, not with chance, but with breath held steady. This time, the sword was ready, but so was the silence. And between the two, the monk still walked. The boy was born on a silent morning. Snow fell like prayer cloths over the palace walls, and the cypress trees bowed beneath the weight of winter. No horns were blown. No scrolls announced his arrival. But the midwife later said the infant did not cry, not once. He opened his eyes and simply watched as if the world was something he had already seen. They named him Hyeongjong, after the twin peaks visible from the capital. He was the only son of Hyeongjong, the only future, and the king loved him. Fiercely, quietly, with the same devotion he gave to rebuilding a kingdom from ash. But even as a child, Hyeongjong was different. Where his father lingered in gardens and scribal halls, the boy preferred the clang of training yards. He asked questions not about law, but about bloodlines. When given a brush, he drew swords. When told to listen, he demanded to speak. At 6, he challenged the palace instructor to a duel with wooden rods. At 10, he demanded to attend a military campaign as a messenger. By 12, he had read every account of the Liao invasion. Each marginal note made by Hyeongjong, and asked why the enemy had been allowed to retreat. They should have been hunted, he said. They should have been broken. His father only watched him. And in the silence between them, a fire began to grow. The courtiers whispered, "He is his grandfather's son." They meant it both as fear and prophecy. The king, remembering the madness of his own lineage, the manipulations, the bloodshed, the hollow crowns, tightened the walls around his son's education. He sent the boy to train with monks. He ordered days of silence. He flooded his quarters with poetry and parables. But the fire only deepened. And one day, the boy stopped obeying. "I'm not a monk," he told his father. "I'm a prince." "And what does that mean?" the king asked. "It means I should never have to kneel." That night, Hyeongjong stood alone in the library, staring at the faceless carving he kept in a silk-lined box. He whispered, "I don't know how to guide him." And though no voice replied, he felt the answer move through the stone beneath his feet. "You must let him burn. But you must choose where." In the spring of Hyeongjong's 17th year, news came of rebellion in the eastern provinces. A minor lord, drunk on rumors of the king's failing health, had raised his banners in open defiance. It was not yet war, but it was a spark. The boy begged to be sent. "Let me put it down," he said. "Let me prove I am ready." Hyeongjong, now aged and half-crippled from years of campaigns, said no. The king said nothing. But that night he rode out alone. The next morning a message came. "He has taken the eastern road." No one dared stop him. Hyeongjong found the king in the silent garden, watching the tree with white gold blossoms sway in the wind. "He's going to kill them," the general said. The king nodded. "Do you want him too?" "No," Hyeongjong replied. "Then why let him go?" "Because he must see what fire does." 3 days later, the prince returned. He rode at the head of a formation of armed men, some bloodied, some smiling. Behind them, for wagons carried the spoils of a shattered manor. The rebels had surrendered before a blade was drawn. But they had been punished anyway. Publicly. Brutally. The boy dismounted, walked into the palace throne hall without bowing, and dropped a burned banner at his father's feet. "It's done," he said. Hyeongjong stared at the cloth. then at his son. And in that moment, he saw not a boy but a mirror, not of himself, but of everything he had tried to bury. "You did what I feared," the king said. "I did what was necessary," the prince replied. "No," the king whispered. "You did what was easy." The silence that followed broke more than just trust. It broke the line between inheritance and worthiness. That night, Hyeongjong did not sleep in the royal quarters. He moved into the barracks. He dined with soldiers. He trained with officers. And soon he stopped being called prince. They called him Flame-born, because wherever he walked, decisions followed. And soon after, consequences. It was a cold morning when the prince first saw her. He had been sparring since before dawn, sweat steaming off his back as he moved through a series of forms, fluid, sharp, relentless. His sword sliced the mist. His breath came like bellows. And then he felt it. A presence. Like a held breath just behind his neck. He turned. She stood at the edge of the training ground, cloaked in gray, hands clasped, eyes unreadable beneath a linen veil. The soldiers around him froze, uncertain. She said nothing. Neither did he. Only after she turned and began to walk away did he move to follow. She led him down an old stone path into the woods, where the wind rustled the branches like an unseen choir. They walked in silence until she stopped beside a moss-covered shrine so old its inscriptions had faded into cracks. "This place has no name," she said finally. He looked at her. "Who are you?" "A question," she replied. He smirked. "You speak like a monk." "I speak like someone who remembers fire." At that his eyes narrowed. "So do I." "No," she said softly. "You remember flame, but not what it leaves behind." He stepped forward. "My father sent you." "No," she said. "Your father once listened. Now I've come to see if you will." He folded his arms. "I don't need lectures." "Then why did you follow me?" He didn't answer. She sat on the cold earth. He didn't move. "You see the world as fuel," she said. "Every insult, every threat, every failure, you burn it to warm your cause. But fire without purpose is just destruction." "My cause is Goryeo," he snapped. "No," she said, her voice calm. "Your cause is yourself." That struck harder than any blade. He turned to leave. But she said one more thing. "Your father was born in ash. You were born in peace. But both of you may die in fire." He didn't return to the barracks that night. He rode out alone into the hills. Sat beneath the stars. Tried to breathe. But the words stayed with him. He remembered the look in his father's eyes, the weight, the silence, the restraint. And for the first time he wondered, was his fury strength? Or was it fear dressed in armor? When he returned, he did not speak of her. But his soldiers noticed a change. He ordered fewer drills. Listened more. Started reading. And sometimes, late at night, he could be seen staring into a candle flame. Not with hunger, but with uncertainty. The king, watching from afar, allowed the silence to stretch. He knew the monk had found him. He knew something had been planted. But would it bloom? Or burn? That question remained unanswered, until the day the northern towers caught fire. Smoke curled into the sky above the border fortress. Not enemy attack, accident, perhaps sabotage. But within hours, rumors spread like wildfire. The Liao were moving. Panic gripped the court. Advisors called for immediate mobilization. Hyeongjong sat in silence. And then the prince entered, dressed in black armor. Sword at his side, eyes bright, but steady. "I will ride north," he said. The king looked up. "Alone. With 100. No banners. No drums. To do what? To see if they mean to invade or if we only think they do." The court erupted. Insanity. Recklessness. Arrogance. But the king raised a hand. And silence returned. "You may go," he said. "But go not as fire." He handed him a token carved of wood. Faceless. Timeless. Go as memory. The prince took it. And for the first time he bowed not as son to father, but as student to teacher. He left that night. And with him went the first ember of something new. The ride north was long and silent. Hyeongjong brought with him 100 riders, no heralds, no crests. Only men he trusted to hold a blade or hold their breath. Through the valleys and lowlands they rode, past the ruins of older wars, the mossy skeletons of watchtowers. The places where his father had once slept under leaves and prayed not to be found. He did not speak of her, but her words rode beside him like a second shadow. "You remember flame, not what it leaves behind." He hated how much sense it made. At the fortress of Yangwangwang, The gates creaked open to let them pass. Inside, the garrison was tense. The fire had gutted a quarter of the supply wing. A few guards were dead, not from battle but from collapse. Smoke still clung to the rafters like doubt. They came through the pass last night. One scout said. Fast. Professional. Didn't kill unless necessary? That was strange. That was deliberate. In the command tent, Wang Song traced the enemy's path across the map. They had not pushed forward. They had scattered, testing routes, measuring silence, feeling out the soft edges of Goryeo's skin. He did not panic. He did not call for reinforcements. He called for a meeting. On the third day it arrived. Not an army. A messenger. Young, trembling, carrying a scroll marked with the black and gold seal of the Khitan Border Command. The message was simple. We remember fire too. Shall we feed it again? Wang Song stared at the scroll for a long time, and then he smiled. Not the smile of arrogance, but the smile of someone who finally sees the shape of the storm. He wrote his reply himself. On paper made from pine bark. In Goryeo script. No seal. No title. Only a line. You may feed it, but we have learned how to carry it. He gave it to the writer, and waited. That night, he sat alone outside the fortress watching the embers of a controlled fire burn low in a copper basin. In his hands, he turned the wooden carving his father had given him, faceless, eternal. The monk's voice returned not in sound, but in memory. Strike only when all other voices have fallen silent. He heard his own voice, years ago, screaming at his father for weakness. And he felt shame. Real shame. For the first time in his life, he saw the cost of unchecked fury. But he also saw something else. The need to use fire not as destruction but as a torch. To light what was hidden. To reveal what was rotting. The next morning, the Liao withdrew. No battle. No blood. Just silence. And with it, respect. Back in Gyeongjong, the king received a report not of victory but of understanding. His son had not struck. He had spoken. And in doing so, he had preserved not just peace but his own soul. That night, Hyeongjong returned to the shrine beneath the blooming tree. He lit incense. He placed another wooden figure beside the first. Two now. Side by side. One for the past. One for the future. And as the smoke rose into the sky, he whispered. The flame lives. But now it listens. The wind over the northern plains carried with it no sound. Only weight. Winter had not yet begun. But the trees bent as if bracing for something old, something remembered. The scouts of Goryeo moved like shadows across the ridges, their breath-forming ghosts in the cold air. From the hilltops they could see the banners. Black and gold. Hundreds. Then thousands. Then tens of thousands. The Lu were coming again. Not as raiders, but as vengeance. 18 years had passed since their last retreat. Goryeo had humiliated them. Not with overwhelming strength, but with survival, with silence, with memory. And now the empire to the north had returned. This time they brought over 100,000 men. Armored cavalry from the steppe. Siege engines dragged across frozen rivers. And commanders who had once tasted defeat and vowed never again. At the palace in Gyeongjong, the council waited for the king's word. But he gave none. Not at first. He sent instead a single messenger to a house on the southern edge of the capital, modest, plain, with a stone path carved by footfall over the years. Gang Gamchan opened the door before the messenger knocked. I know, he said. Inside, the old general's sword lay unpolished on a shrine. It had not left its scabbard in years. His knees ached. His lungs burned in the cold. But his eyes were sharp as ever. He took the message. Read the 4 words. Come. It begins again. And he smiled. He arrived at the palace 2 days later, dressed in travel-worn robes. He bowed before the king, not deeply, not formally. Only enough to show that the bond between them needed no ceremony. I'll need 1,000, he said. Take 10. The king replied. Gamchan raised an eyebrow. I want you to break them, the king added. Not fight them. The general nodded. He understood. Victory was not enough. This had to be a lesson. Wang Song was at the war table when the strategy was formed. But he spoke little. He stood behind his father, behind his mentor, and listened. Watched. Learned. And when the army moved north, he did not lead it. He followed it. Because sometimes the flame must observe how it catches light. The Goryeo army marched slowly, deliberately. They avoided open roads, used terrain like a cloak. Gamchan studied weather like a scholar, predicted fog like scripture. He turned rivers into traps, hills into shields, farmers into informants. The first Liao detachments encountered nothing. Then, too much. Burning camps, poisoned wells, roads flooded overnight. Then an ambush near the Yangqian Pass, 500 Liao cavalry surrounded, choked by mud and fire. By the third week, the invaders grew anxious. By the fourth, they grew afraid. The general of the Liao vanguard, Xiaopaya, sent word to his emperor. They are not meeting us with force. They are dissolving us with ghosts. Then came the river, the Chongshan, winding like a serpent through the northern plain, swollen with winter rains. Gamchan stood on its western bank, eyes scanning the fog. Wang Song stood beside him. They will try to cross at dawn, Gamchan said. And if they do? The old general pointed to the embankment. I've placed everything we need inside the earth. It was not until years later that Goryeo would fully understand what had happened beneath their feet. Gamchan had spent months preparing the ground along the Chongshan. Hidden palisades, waterlogged pits, caches of fire oil buried in sealed urns, arrows dipped in frost, and a strategy that required perfect timing. When the Liao army began to ford the river at sunrise, they found no resistance. Only fog, only footprints, only bait. They cheered. Until the first explosion. Then the ground began to burn. And then it began to scream. From the mist came Goryeo archers, not in rank but in rhythm. Not firing volleys but singing death in synchronized release. The fog caught fire. The river boiled. Horses screamed as they slipped on oiled stones. Drums beat not from Goryeo lines, but from within the Liao ranks. Captured instruments returned as chaos. Wang Song led a flank charge through the reeds, blade drawn, eyes clear. He did not shout. He simply moved, like fire that has learned to dance. By mid-morning, the Liao army had fractured. By noon, they were retreating. By dusk, they were running. And Goryeo did not follow. Because Gamchan said only one thing. Let the river carry the rest. Night fell like a curtain of ash. The river Chongshan, still steaming from fire and blood, coiled across the darkened plain. Smoke rose in thin columns where pyres had been lit, not to celebrate, but to mourn. The wind no longer carried the clash of iron or the thunder of hooves, it carried the weight of memory. And across that stillness, the men of Goryeo worked in silence. They did not chant. They did not cheer. They gathered the fallen with hands hardened by frost and mud, wrapped them in the gray cloth of duty, and placed them gently into the earth. These were not warriors of glory. They were witnesses to what restraint could achieve. Above them, on a low ridge now slick with dew and dust, General Gang Gamchan stood like a shadow carved from stone. The years had not spared his body, his joints ached. His back bent more deeply now than ever before, but his gaze was unflinching. He watched not the battlefield. He watched the discipline. There were no spoils being hoarded, no captured flags paraded. The soldiers moved like farmers returning to their fields after a storm, knowing the land had survived, and that was enough. To many, this was the greatest victory in Goryeo's history. But to Gamchan, it was something else. It was proof that memory was stronger than ambition, that a kingdom could learn. At the edge of the ruined enemy camp, a shallow stream ran black with soot. Once, the Liao banners had fluttered along this bank, gold-threaded, cruelly elegant. Now they lay trampled beneath frozen mud. Their commanders had fled. Their formations had dissolved. They were not destroyed by might, but dismantled by patience. The general turned away before the last of the fires died out. He walked slowly toward the command tent, boots cracking across frostbitten grass. Inside, the map still lay spread across the table, weighted by river stones. Red ink had once marked enemy movement, now it looked like blood spilled by someone trying to stop time. He didn't need to look at it anymore. Everything that needed to be done had already been done. Far from the front lines, in the capital of Gyeongjong, word of the victory arrived not by trumpet, but by rider mud-streaked, half-starved, carrying nothing but a scroll and a voice that could barely speak the message before collapsing at the palace gates. The court erupted in disbelief. The generals shouted. The ministers wept. But the king, Hyeongjong, simply closed his eyes. Not in relief, in stillness. He had seen the war long before it began. And now its ending was not triumph, it was confirmation. that everything they had built, every school, every law carved in humility, every word chosen carefully in council, every moment of silence instead of fury had been worth it. He rose before dawn the next morning and walked alone to the eastern garden. There, under the white blossom tree that had once grown above a buried wooden carving, he stood and watched the petals fall. Each one drifted like a prayer, like the memory of a voice that had never needed to raise itself to change the world. Later that day he gathered the court. There was no crown on his head, no robe of state, only his voice, calm and deliberate. The war is over. The kingdom remains. But we will not carve statues for this day. We will carve schools, and granaries, and roads to places no one has thought important enough to reach. Because now, every corner of this land matters. And they listened, because in his tone, they heard the echo of every year he had chosen to build rather than conquer. In the northern hills, the soldiers began to return, not as conquerors but as caretakers. Many came back changed. Some carried fragments of burned Liao flags, not as trophies, but as warnings. Some brought back river stones, blackened but intact. Most brought back silence. Wang Song, the prince once called Flame-born, did not return immediately. He stayed behind, wandering among the villages near the border. He ate with peasants who had hidden during the invasion, helped repair their bridges, listened to their stories. He had seen what fire could do. Now he wanted to understand what it could not fix. One night, in a half-collapsed temple near the foothills, he found a small wooden figure left atop an altar. No writing, no offering, just the shape of the Faceless Monk carved roughly but with care. He stared at it for a long time. Then he placed his sword beside it and walked away. The road southward thawed slowly with the end of winter. From the borderlands, soldiers filtered back into cities like quiet rivers returning to the sea. There were no parades, no banners waved in triumph. The victories had been buried with the dead, and the survivors returned with eyes that saw differently. Not just enemy formations, but hunger in the eyes of a child. Not just strategy, but the broken wheel of a farmer's cart. They no longer measured glory by the size of an army, but by the peace they could protect. Gang Gamcheon returned last. He entered Gyeonggi on foot, wearing no armor, accompanied only by a boy no older than 14, an orphan from the battlefield whom he refused to leave behind. The people recognized him but did not cheer. They bowed wordlessly, and he returned the gesture as one of them. His reward from the king was not gold nor title. It was time. Time to teach. Time to remember. He spent the remainder of his years in a small stone house on the edge of the capital, training not warriors but listeners. He spoke to young scribes, to temple novices, to stammering future magistrates who could barely hold a brush. And always beside him sat the boy, learning not how to kill, but how to observe. Once, years later, the boy asked, "Why didn't you ever build a statue of yourself?" The old general chuckled, "Because one fire is enough." In the palace, King Hyeongjong grew quieter with each passing year. He no longer rode out to inspect the provinces. He sent letters instead, personally written, unsealed, bearing only his name and a single wooden token, the faceless figure. They became symbols of trust, a sign that the king did not rule above, but among. He refused to rewrite history. Instead, he commissioned the carving of the Tripitaka Koreana to begin again, this time in full, with more than 80,000 wooden blocks. It would take decades. Many of the artisans who began the work would not live to see its completion. But he believed in seeds, not harvests. That belief, too, came from her. She was never named, never recorded. But across the kingdom, whispers remained of a monk without face who had spoken to generals, to kings, to fire itself. Some claimed she had returned to the mountains. Others said she had passed into legend. A few believed she had never existed at all. But then they would see the wooden figures, passed from hand to hand, placed in corners of classrooms, council halls, and even kitchens. And they would remember. She was not meant to be seen, only to be heard in the silence that came before wisdom. As the king's health waned, he asked for no tomb, no royal rites, only that he be buried under the tree in the eastern garden without inscription. The ministers protested. The court was aghast. But the prince, now matured and tempered by war, placed a hand on his father's shoulder and said, "Let the roots carry your name." And so it was done. Years later, children would play beneath the blossoms of that tree, unaware that beneath their feet lay the bones of a king who had once rebuilt a kingdom not with conquest, but with patience. And on certain spring mornings, when the wind passed just right through the garden, the petals would swirl in patterns that felt intentional, as if someone was still watching, still guiding, not with commands, but with quiet. He was not crowned with trumpets, nor did he ride a white horse into the capital. When Hyeongjong became king, the sky over Gyejeong was gray, not from omen, but from rain. A soft, constant drizzle, as if the heavens themselves had decided to mourn the end of an era with quiet dignity. The tree under which his father had been buried dropped its blossoms one by one, pale as the hands of a monk in meditation. No decree was issued that day, no proclamations, only the soft shuffle of footsteps as the court gathered not in celebration, but in stillness. Because they knew, this was not the coronation of a warrior, this was the awakening of a legacy. Hyeongjong entered the royal hall wearing the same dark robes his father had worn in his final years. No crown rested on his head. Only the faint glimmer of a wooden token, faceless, worn smooth by time, rested in his palm. He did not sit on the throne that day. He walked past it, and into the library. There, he unrolled the first edict of his reign. Let no man be feared for silence. Let no law be louder than a monk's breath. Let the ink flow before the sword. Some called it weakness. Others called it madness. But the elders, those who remembered the river, the flame, and the woman who had walked between them, understood. The kingdom had turned a page. Hyeongjong ruled differently. Where his grandfather had punished disobedience with public executions, Hyeongjong created councils, small, rotating assemblies of farmers, merchants, monks, and even children, to advise his ministers on local matters. He did not erase the structures of old Goryeo but infused them with breath organic, flawed, but alive. In temples once used to store grain during wartime, he built schools. In old towers once used to watch for northern raiders, he planted bells not for alarm but to mark prayer. And in the great square of Gyejeong, where once soldiers had marched in drills, he built a stone garden. No statue of his father stood there. Only a slab inscribed with words in plain script. Remember what did not burn. But peace, like fire, does not last unless tended. By the 3rd year of his reign, murmurs had begun. Not from beyond the borders but from within. The nobility and used to governance shaped by listening, grew restless. Their sons, denied titles for lack of merit, whispered that the crown had gone soft. Some priests, angry at the elevation of unorthodox schools and female scholars, began preaching against the erosion of divine order. Even among the people, a quiet question took root. If the sword was not drawn, would it rust? It was in this atmosphere that a letter arrived. No seal, no name, just 5 words, written in old calligraphy. The temple remembers. Return now. He knew where it came from, and he knew who had sent it. For years, the faceless monk had not appeared. Not in dreams, not in symbols, only in echoes, subtle, indirect, folded into the daily choices of those she had once touched. But now she was calling again. He left the palace that night without escort. Dressed in traveler's robes, he took the path that curved west of the capital, through the forest of old pines, past the river where he had once placed his sword beside her carving. It took him 2 days to reach the temple. The structure was small, unremarkable, wood darkened by decades of wind and moss. No gold, no incense, just silence. Inside, he found no monks, no guards, no chants, only her. Older now, or perhaps simply unchanged, untouched by the erosion of time that marked the rest of them. She sat before an unlit brazier. He sat across from her. For a long time, neither spoke. Then she said, "You've begun to forget." He did not argue. She continued, "You rule like a man who fears his own memory. You listen, yes, but not deeply. You speak, yes, but not fully. You walk like your father, but without the weight. I carry it," he said softly. "You carry the crown, not the burden." Outside, the wind picked up. Bamboo rustled like paper torn in half. "I don't want to become them," he said. "Then don't," she answered. "But I also don't want to be forgotten." The monk looked at him, and for the first time her voice became firm. "Then serve something bigger than remembrance." He stayed in the temple for 5 days. In that time, he spoke little. He swept the courtyard, carried water, copied scripture. No one asked who he was. No one bowed. And it was in that absence of deference, of hierarchy, that he found clarity. When he returned to Gyeong, something had shifted. He dissolved the court for a week, sent the ministers home, declared a quiet season, a time not of harvest, but of listening. In that week, no laws were passed, no judgments rendered. Instead, messengers were sent to every province asking one question. What does your village fear most? The answers varied. Some feared famine. Some feared floods. Some feared the loss of stories. But the one answer that arrived most often was unexpected. We fear that we no longer matter. Changed him deeply. He saw now that peace could be just as violent as war, when it forgot the periphery, when it crowned the center and ignored the edge. He began traveling, disguised, unannounced, not to inspect but to witness. In one mountain village, he met a blind girl who could recite law better than the magistrate. He made her a scholar. In a fishing town, he met a widow who had defended her shoreline from pirates using only bells and mirrors. He made her a captain. In a ruined way station, he found a monk carving wooden toys for orphans from the debris of an old fortress. He made him his advisor. The capital did not always understand. The ministers grumbled. But the kingdom began to breathe differently. Not louder, not faster, just deeper. Years passed. The temple in the forest remained untouched. No shrine was ever built for the Faceless Monk, but her name, still never spoken, became known in how people chose to act. They began placing blank stones beside graves. They began opening council meetings with a moment of shared silence. And in the margins of law books, scribes began to draw a small figure with no face, always watching, never judging. Legacy had taken root, but not in monuments, in choices. Hyeongjong grew older. Not as his father had, bent by years of crisis, but worn by constant humility. When his hair turned white, he laughed. When his knees failed, he sat with children and asked them to read to him. And one day, without warning, he walked out of the palace, into the forest, alone. No one ever saw him again. But 2 months later, a traveler passing through the temple swore he had seen an old man sweeping leaves from the steps beside a monk whose face he could not remember. When asked what the monk had said, the traveler answered. She didn't say anything. She just handed him a brush and pointed to the floor. And what did he write? The traveler thought for a moment, then said, he wrote, "Let this be enough." And it was. They called it the Bright Era. The annals would later mark those 2 decades under King Hyeongjong's reign as the most stable period Goryeo had ever known. Famine was rare. Trade flowed. Even the winds that once howled down from the northern steppes now passed more gently over the plains, as if the land itself had grown quiet with relief. But beneath the peace, something else stirred. It began slowly, as it always does, in the way children forgot the names of the dead, in how temples once tended daily fell into minor disrepair, not through neglect, but through assumption. That someone else would sweep the dust, that someone else would light the lamp. And in the capital, the courtiers began to speak more freely again, not in hushed reverence, but in indulgent curiosity. They whispered of trade expeditions to foreign ports. They argued about art, about fashion, about the merits of imported perfume from Song China. They forgot the silence that had saved them. It was not evil. It was simply erosion. Hyeongjong, now older, frail in body but not in mind, watched from behind palace screens. He no longer walked the streets of Gyeong. His vision had dimmed. His hands trembled. But his thoughts remained sharp, precise as ever. He read every report. He noticed every name. And he saw it coming. The forgetting. One morning, as the first snow of the season began to fall across the black-tiled roofs of the capital, he called for the archivist. An old man, half-blind and stoop-shouldered, entered the royal study carrying a stack of scrolls tied in faded silk. "You have something to show me?" Hyeongjong asked. The archivist nodded. "It's from the border town of Seohi," he said. "A record of a council dispute." The king untied the scroll himself. He read it once, then twice, then lowered it to the table. "They removed her," he said. The archivist did not answer. He didn't need to. The villagers in Seohi, descendants of those who had once built silent shrines to the Faceless Monk, had finally decided to replace her. The blank stone had been removed. A statue of a local hero now stood in its place, sword raised, chin lifted toward the sky. Because they say it's more inspiring, the report read. More visible. More fitting for a generation of action. Wang Song did not speak for a long time. He merely reached into the folds of his robe and removed the same wooden carving he had carried since youth. Still faceless. Still intact. Still heavier than it looked. He set it gently beside the scroll. The next day he issued his final decree. It was not long. It was not poetic. It simply read. The path grows narrow. Let those who remember teach. Let those who have forgotten be forgiven. But let no one pretend they built the road alone. No one understood at first. But across the kingdom, small things began to happen. Old council halls reopened archives. Schoolmasters began each lesson not with doctrine but with silence. Carpenters in fishing villages began carving small blank figures again, placing them quietly on shelves, on boats, on family altars. But even then the tide could not be fully turned. The world beyond Goryeo had changed. Ships from distant lands began arriving on southern shores, bearing silk, mirrors, books written in scripts never seen before. With them came new ideas of law, of commerce, of kings chosen by coin rather than legacy. And with those ships came envoys. They spoke of progress, of alliances, of wealth, but they asked for something in return. Access, not just to goods but to minds, to the hearts of the young. And some in the court listened, not with malice, but with hunger. Wang Song watched it all unfold from the solitude of his study. He did not resist. He did not ban foreign envoys. He did not stop new schools from opening. But he did send one final message to every province, to be read aloud in every village square. We are not the fire. We are the ones who learned to carry it. And if we forget how, it will consume us again. The wind carried his words far, but time carried them farther. Years passed. The king's health waned. He spent his final days not in the palace but in a small room above the royal library, surrounded by scrolls, wooden blocks, and a candle that never burned brighter than needed. He saw no advisors. He met with no generals. He spoke only once to a young girl who had come to sweep the floor. She was 12, daughter of a scribe. Curious, bright-eyed. She asked him, "Were you ever afraid, my king?" He looked at her and smiled. "Only when I forgot to listen." That night he passed away. No trumpet was sounded. No edict was issued. Only the quiet spreading of ink as scribes across Goryeo began copying one last inscription into the margins of every lawbook. Do not forget the faceless. And so he was buried beneath the same tree where his father lay, its blossoms now fewer, its branches gnarled with age. No name was carved. Only two small wooden figures placed side by side, facing the sunrise. But the kingdom did not fall into chaos, nor did it rise into conquest. It simply continued, with its people caught between remembering and forgetting, with its new rulers unsure whether silence was wisdom or weakness, and with a shadow that remained not as threat but as question, one that would echo long after thrones crumbled and empires passed, a question whispered through stone temples, through folded cloth, through every child who ever stared at a blank wooden carving and asked, who was she? And somewhere, perhaps in a place long since buried by time, someone would answer, not with words, but with silence. The scroll arrived without fanfare. A simple message carried by a rider whose horse was more dust than muscle, whose eyes bore the exhaustion of 1,000 forgotten roads. The seal was unfamiliar. Not royal, not noble, but etched in ink so dense it bled through the parchment. A single black circle. Inside, 12 lines of writing, 12 questions, each one sharper than the last. Why is silence considered holy? Who chose the faceless over the brave? What truth is hidden in humility? How long must we kneel before we walk? And at the end, no name, only a signature drawn as a broken wheel. The court dismissed it at first. A scribe's riddle, a child's rebellion, a curiosity. But then came the second scroll, then a third, each arriving from a different province, each quoting sermons delivered not in temples but in empty marketplaces, each accompanied by rumors of a man walking barefoot through the hills, gathering not swords but students, young men and women burned by bureaucracy, orphans raised on myths they could not test. scholars without titles, soldiers without war. He did not call himself a prophet. He called himself a mirror. And slowly, that mirror began to reflect something no one wanted to see: discontent. The boy was born Nam Jae-hyun, son of a monk who had once been expelled from the central temple for declaring that the Faceless Monk had erred in her silence. A boy who grew up hungry in the margins of history, who listened not to legends but to the sound of people forgetting. He did not hate the kings. He did not hate the monk. He hated that the world had built a shrine to memory and called it progress. By the age of 23, he had already written 3 treatises. The first, Silence is Not Neutrality, an argument that humility, when institutionalized, becomes a tool of the powerful. The second, The Blood in the Blossom, a poetic reconstruction of the Goryeo invasions, arguing that the Faceless Monk's philosophy, while noble, had prevented the people from understanding their own power. The third, The Road of Broken Wheels, a manifesto calling for the re-narration of Goryeo's founding myths. Let the young remember their strength, he wrote. Let the fire no longer ask permission to burn. We owe the dead no loyalty if their silence costs the living their voice. It spread like wildfire, at first in hidden circles, then in open squares, then in the capital. His followers called themselves the Circle Broken. They carried no weapons, only ink and rope. They tied ropes around monuments, not to pull them down, but to remind others they had been erected, not descended. That history was not inherited, it was constructed. And at the center of it all, Jae-hyun, young, sharp-eyed, voice like water-slicing stone. He wore no symbols, no rank, but everywhere he went people listened. And somewhere deep within the hills beyond the capital, he began to build, not a temple, a school. But unlike the schools of Gyeong, this one had no gate, no exams, no portraits of kings, only questions painted on every wall. Who taught you what you believe? What would you die for if not your name? Who is the right to forget? By the time the regent of Goryeo's new child king summoned his council to address the movement, it had already reached 12 provinces. They tried to ban the texts. They only spread faster. They tried to arrest the speakers. But there were too many, too scattered, too ordinary. Nam Jae-hyun became a myth not because he claimed to be one, but because he refused to. The regency was caught between fear and awe. And in the silence that followed the 10th decree outlawing the Circle Broken, a single wooden carving was found nailed to the door of the royal hall. Faceless, split in half. A message, not of destruction, but of division. Across the countryside, conversations began to shift. Children asked their teachers, why was the monk silent? Farmers asked their magistrates, if the king serves, who serves the king? Old men whispered, is this rebellion or reckoning? And always Jae-hyun answered the same way. This is not rebellion. This is the river returning to its source. Then came the turning point. A fire in the southern port of Haeju. A library burned to the ground. No lives lost, but 5,000 texts reduced to ash. The officials blamed the Circle Broken. Jae-hyun issued a statement. We light no flames. We hold only mirrors. If the fire you see reflects your fear, that is not our fault. But the damage was done. The regency declared him an enemy of the state. Troops were sent. Villages were searched. Dozens were arrested. And yet no resistance. No armies. No fortresses. Only more mirrors. Each time a shrine was desecrated, another appeared. Each time a carving was shattered, someone whittled 2 more. It became a movement without center. A voice without a mouth. And then Jae-hyun disappeared. Just as his name reached its loudest echo, he vanished. Some say he fled to the mountains. Others said he was captured and executed in secret. But in truth, no one knows. Only this remained, a final scroll left on the doorstep of the Royal Academy. 12 new questions. Each one softer than before. What if silence was a gift, not a cage? What if remembrance is not obedience, but gratitude? What if I was wrong? The regency never answered. But the people did. Some read the scroll and wept. Some tore it up. Some memorized every word. And across the kingdom, new wooden carvings began to appear, not faceless, but with 2 faces carved back to back. One calm, one crying out, and beneath them, a phrase. May we carry both. The mountain did not speak. It had never spoken. Even as kingdoms rose and fell, even as the soil at its base turned from battlefield to rice field and back again. It remained a jagged silhouette against the horizon, wrapped in mist and memory. They called it Dalseong. The locals said it was sacred, that beneath its roots were buried the regrets of kings, the voices of monks, and the bones of those who had loved something greater than themselves. No one dared build on its slopes, not from fear but from reverence, because some silences are not meant to be broken. And it was there, after centuries, that the story returned. Not with banners, not with fire, but with one traveler. No one knew his name. He came from the west, clothed in a robe stitched with the dust of many provinces. His eyes were old, but his hands moved with the care of someone still learning. On his back, a satchel of wood carvings, blank-faced, some split, some whole, some paired. He said little, but he asked many questions. In the villages below the mountain he listened. To the children who recited both the monks' proverbs and the heretics' questions as if they were lullabies. To the old who had forgotten their own names, but remembered the silence of the past like a taste. To the ministers who governed by routine and still lit incense to both kings and critics alike. And at night, he sat alone by the stream that wound around the base of Dalseong and whittled. Not just carvings, but answers. One day, a young girl approached him. She was no older than 10. She wore no shoes. She carried no books. Only a question. Was the monk real? The traveler smiled. He handed her a carving. 2 faces, one with eyes closed, one with mouth open, and said she was never the point. Then, without ceremony, he began the climb. It took him 3 days. No one followed. No one needed to, for everyone in their own way had already made the journey. And at the summit, among the wind-worn stones and the moss-streaked remains of what might have once been an altar, he stopped. He did not build a monument. He did not light a flame. He simply sat and listened, not for a voice, but for an echo. And it came, not in words, but in the pattern of falling leaves, in the stillness between gusts of wind, in the way the mountain held every memory without naming them. He laid his final carving there, not in the center, not on a pedestal, just beneath a tree whose roots gripped the earth like old hands holding breath. Then he turned away, and was gone. No one saw him again. But in the years that followed, something strange began to happen. Not quickly, not loudly, but steadily. In schools, children were taught 2 stories side by side. One of a monk who had knelt in rain beside fire and chose silence. One of a heretic who shattered mirrors only to show people their own eyes. And in between them, the story of those who listened. The weavers, the mothers, the generals who disbanded their armies. The kings who passed without epitaph. The carpenters who carved without names. Across Goryeo, new temples were not built. Instead, spaces were left empty. Open courtyards, quiet gardens, reading halls without statues. Not because they lacked stories, but because they no longer needed to contain them. A philosophy emerged. Some called it the balance, others the dual path, but most simply called it the mountain and the mirror. Not a doctrine, not a rule, but a way to hold both silence and sound without letting either consume the other. And at the heart of it, always, was a small wooden figure, carved and recarved by 1,000 hands. Sometimes faceless, sometimes two-faced, sometimes cracked, but always offered, always passed along, never claimed, never sold, only given. By the time the final chroniclers of the Goryeo era sat down to compile their histories, they faced a dilemma. There were too many stories, too many truths, too many names that had chosen to disappear so the people could remember why. So they wrote the last chapter differently. Not as a timeline, not as a king list, but as a parable. It began with a girl asking a question, and ended with a mountain that did not answer. Because sometimes the most honest thing a history can do is leave space for those yet to ask, for those yet to choose, for those yet to listen.